I'd like to welcome everyone tonight. We are having what I'm calling an evening extra, meaning that this is a special program that was basically gifted to us at the World Affairs Council of Maine because of my good friend and colleague here, Professor Rebecca Davis Gibbons of the University of Southern Maine's Political Science Department. We were really excited to be able to cooperate on this because this is a very important topic and something that I'm sure we're all thinking about in terms of what the next 4.5 years or so are going to mean in terms of global affairs and how do we understand what may happen on the basis of, things that have been going on, particularly in terms of the use or non-use of nuclear weapons. It's also exciting for us because it's a chance to get more students connected with the World Affairs Council. We have our first student board rep right here, Riley Worth, who is now officially on our board of representatives, and that's really important to us because you guys are the future of global engagement in Maine, and so we really want you to be engaged, come to our programs. We have a free student membership program. It's a great thing to have on your resume, and it costs nothing. And when you come to our regular events, even if they're events that have a ticket price, just send us an email because we actually, thanks to our members, we actually have a student ticket fund. So if there's ever an event that you want to attend, just drop us a line and we can put you on the list. And it's a great opportunity, not just to hear amazing and interesting speakers, but also interact with our membership. We have members who are from all over the world, who have worked all over the world in all kinds of different interesting careers, and they love to engage with students as well. So thank you guys for being here. I'm Allison Hodgkins. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Maine, and I want to, again, thank Professor Davis Gibbons for organizing this event. I want to thank our speaker for giving up his time in the United States to come up here and share his research with us. And of course, I also want to thank the members of the World Affairs Council of Maine and people who sponsored tonight's program because we can't do this work without you guys. You guys are not here to listen to me, so with no further ado, I'm going to pull up my little cheat sheet here and formally introduce Professor Gibbons, who is going to moderate tonight's panel and also introduce our speaker. So most of you guys know her as your professor. She's an associate professor now at the Department of Political Science here, and she previously served as a fellow and associate of the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She's got kind of a small CV. She had her PhD from Georgetown and has also done a stint at Bowdoin. Her research is really focused on the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and she has a really interesting book that has just come out called The Hegemon's Toolkit: U.S. Leadership and the Politics of Nuclear Non-Proliferation Regime. And I encourage you to check that out. So we're really fortunate to have her and her research connections as part of the council. And I want to turn things over to you to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I want to thank Allison Hodgkins and the rest of the World Affairs Council for hosting this event tonight. I want to reiterate what she said to all of you students who are in the audience. Please join the World Affairs Council. It is free. Maybe after you do it tonight, you can send me an email just telling me that you did that, in addition to your email that you're going to send me anyway about being here. We're really lucky to have the World Affairs Council and Allison, and they do so many events and have such a small staff, and it's just really incredible what they do. So please get on their email list and see what they have going on. My pleasure here is to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Michal Smetana. He is an associate professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University, the director of the Peace Research Center in Prague, the head researcher at the Experimental Lab for International Security Studies, and a principal investigator of the European Research Council project Micro Foundations of Collective Defense. And that last project is funded by the European Union, is that right? And it was a competitive process that took a long time. And so it's a very big deal that he was able to get funding and be the principal investigator for that project. Before that, he was a Fulbright Scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford, known as CSAC, and a visiting research fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which we call SIPRI, and the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. And so for those of you who know me and have taken my nuclear class, Dr. Smetana's research interests intersect a lot with my own. He is professor of international relations, he looks at political psychology, and he focuses on how nuclear weapons affect world politics. He looks at arms control, disarmament, norm contestation, frozen conflicts, and public opinion. I'm not going to go through all his publications. He is very widely published in our field. And today he's going to talk about the nuclear taboo. This is the topic of his next book, which he already has a contract for, and he hasn't written it yet, and that is always a really great thing. So congratulations, that's with Stanford University Press, so he's in the process of writing that. If you've taken my classes, and maybe even if you haven't, if you've been reading the news, you know that nuclear issues, unfortunately, are very much at the forefront of our minds today. Just 2 days ago, Vladimir Putin signed off on changing Russia's nuclear doctrine to make it so, to lower the threshold for nuclear use. So to say, and why did he do this, right? Because the Biden administration just approved for missiles to be shot deeper in, missiles supplied by the US to be shot deeper into Russian territory. And so now the nuclear doctrine says that if any country with nuclear weapons assists another country that attacks Russia, then nuclear weapons can be used, right? So he is trying to warn the US and US allies about continuing to aid Ukraine. Personally, I assume that Biden was willing to do this because he assumes that it's going to be different in the Trump administration and that Putin will not use nuclear weapons in the next 2 months. That's kind of what I'm hoping. That's my reading. I don't know what you think. But anyway, it's really important for us to be discussing these issues. And so I will turn this over to Michal to talk to us about the contested nuclear taboo in the third nuclear age.
All right. Perfect. This should work. Rebecca, will you maybe turn it off so that there's no feedback? Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, for having me here. Thank you so much to the World Affairs Council for having me here tonight. And thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Before I start the presentation, I should make a few notes. First of all, this is a book project. It's a work in progress. I have a preliminary green light from Stanford University Press, but it's by far not at the stage where I'm hoping it would be today. So it's a work in progress, but it also means that I'm really appreciating any comments, ideas, or suggestions. So that's point number one. Point number two is that, frankly, this is a specific presentation type to a research project, which is based on a lot of statistics and stuff. We are discussing it before with Rebecca. I will try to keep this stuff to a relatively limited amount, and I'm totally welcome, let's say, conversation afterwards, which would be maybe vaguely related to this project, to nuclear weapons, but maybe to also what's happening right now when it comes to Russia and Ukraine and Russian nuclear threats and basically everything that Rebecca was already talking before. So I'm absolutely happy to engage with that, because I hope that even if this is based on a very specific project, which is very academic, it's dealing with international norms and how we contest them and how they change. But yeah, I mean, I hope it tells a little bit broader story about the role of nuclear weapons in world politics. So, without further ado,
So since the end of the Second World War, nuclear weapons have not been used, which is in a way strange, since nuclear armed states have produced a massive amount of nuclear weapons, made very elaborate plans on how to use them in conflicts, fought a number of wars which were important. Some of these wars were even lost by these states, and they didn't resort to nuclear use, despite the fact that there were actually proposals by military officials that their use would be militarily feasible and maybe desirable. A case in point would be the war in Korea, for example, in the 1950s, when the United States decided not to use nuclear weapons, despite the fact that very high-ranking General MacArthur was actually proposing it as a way of winning the war, and the whole conflict ended up with a very painful stalemate. So for a long time during the Cold War, there was an idea that the reason why states don't use nuclear weapons is mainly because of so-called deterrence, right? That states, United States and Soviet Union, are not using weapons against each other because they are simply afraid that it will be mutually destroyed. The problem is that nuclear-armed states didn't use nuclear weapons even against non-nuclear countries, where we wouldn't expect that these countries would be able to retaliate. So Nina Tannenwald basically came in the 1990s and suggested there is some explanation missing. And what she tried to do was to try to track the origins and emergence and development of an international norm, which is informal, it's not coded in any treaties, but through factors like public pressure and elite views and like the general non-use that has been strengthening over the years. Nina Tannenwald claimed that this international norm basically developed and made the use of nuclear weapons virtually unthinkable. States generally think it's a wrong thing to do, no matter how big or small the nuclear explosion is, it doesn't matter. Simply using nuclear weapons is a bad thing. And it has been going for so long that today any use of nuclear weapons is coming with such a high political cost that states simply don't even consider it in most circumstances, except for the most extreme circumstances when their survival is at stake. So this is the story. But in 2018, Nina actually wrote a very interesting piece, which seemed to be going quite against what she had done before in her life. And she argued that the taboo that has emerged and she was tracking for such a long time is now being threatened, is possibly eroded, and maybe it's even vanishing. She argued that stuff like modernization of nuclear arsenals, disintegration of arms control in architecture, lack of nuclear disarmament by nuclear armed states, and other issues which are mainly connected with this great power competition that is taking place in world politics, is basically putting a lot of stress on the nuclear taboo. And there is a danger that the taboo might be now eroded. And flash forward 4 years, it would seem that she was completely right. In February 2022, Russia has invaded Ukraine. The fight is still ongoing, and since the very first day, it's been happening under what we can call a nuclear shadow. So since the very first speech of Vladimir Putin justifying the invasion, there were hints, more or less explicit over time, that there is a nuclear aspect of the conflict, in the sense that Russia would consider using nuclear weapons in case the West would intervene directly in the conflict. There have been a number of these threats over years. Russia also did some other steps which we call escalatory, such as suspending the New START, the last treaty that exists that regulated nuclear arsenals of the two superpowers. Russia also shared nuclear weapons with Belarus and took steps to update its public nuclear doctrine, as Rebecca has mentioned before me. And for many observers, many journalists, many experts, this was a clear sign that all of this increased salience of nuclear weapons, that suddenly weapons are everywhere, is basically making taboo disappear. The taboo is eroded, and some would even claim that the taboo is dying, or maybe it's dead altogether now. This is where usually academics come and provide some skepticism, and this is what I did. So all these claims about the taboo being eroded, weaker, or dying made me thinking. The problem is that all these claims basically assume that violating the nuclear taboo, or in this case actually just talking about the violation of a nuclear taboo, that this would automatically damage the norm and make it weaker. But we know from sociology that this is not really how social norms work. Many powerful norms that we know in society or international society are contested or even straight are violated from time to time. I mean, including some very powerful taboos, like the taboo against cannibalism, for example. I mean, we do have cases from time to time when this very strong norm is violated in different contexts. And we don't necessarily consider these norms to be automatically eroded or even dead when that happens, right? When you are reading the news about a very horrific case of cannibalism, the reaction is not usually, okay, now we are afraid that other people will start eating human flesh, right? That's not the usual reaction. In fact, the sociologists often agree and often stress that occasional violations of norm, not frequent, but occasional, sometimes have a paradoxical opposite effect, that these so-called deviant events are showing us that norms actually exist, that they have some role in our society, and also showing us that violating these norms is often met with punishment. And ultimately, these normative transgressions allow society to jointly affirm the validity of these norms, their meaning and hierarchy. We basically, through seeing other people violating it from time to time, we as a society understand that these norms exist and that they are somehow constraining our choices. Another problem that I had as an academic is that very few people in our field were actually able to come up with a meaningful way of measuring the strength or the weakness of the nuclear taboo today compared to what the taboo was before the invasion. Everybody seemed to be just going with their gut feeling that a sudden return of nuclear weapons to public debate signals the weakening of the nuclear taboo. But I'm wondering if our intuition is actually right here. So these are the two guiding questions which made me to propose this book project to Stanford University Press, and I'm currently working on. So very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on the theory that is guiding it, but basically I'm working with an idea which is rooted in the work of sociologist Cristina Bicchieri, to conceptualize nuclear taboo as a social norm, which is based on states having expectations about how other states behave and what is the right thing to do. And through these expectations, this norm exists and operates. Part of it is empirical expectations, which is simply about expecting what other states would do in a certain situation. So in this case, states expect that, save for the extreme circumstances, states simply don't use nuclear weapons first in conflicts, even if it would provide them with some strategic advantage. There are also normative expectations that other states have an understanding about us, that they believe that we should not do it, and if we do it, that they would be willing to go to some length to punish us somehow, to provide us with some social punishment. And there is something that we also call the ontological expectations, which is really about what nuclear weapons are. And in this case, the taboo is very strongly based on an idea that nuclear weapons are very special, that they are very distinct from conventional weapons, and it's not necessarily about how big the explosion is or how many people it can kill. The idea is that even the smallest nuclear explosion that would be used in a conflict is simply wrong, and it's a very different thing. If, for example, the same explosion would be caused by multiple conventional explosions, it would be a very different thing. We simply understand it differently, that there's a very bright line between nuclear and non-nuclear, and we always need to distinguish it. So there are the three sets of expectations that the taboo is based on. Now, the idea of this book, but generally of sociology of norms, is that anti-normative behavior or speech opens some kind of contestation space. So states have a way of basically changing the taboo by changing the social expectations, right? About the way that they speak and the way they behave. This contestation space is a kind of like a social space in which there's a potential to change the norm, make it stronger or weaker, more precise or less precise, relatively more important or less important. And again, doing that through the changing of these expectations that states, public, individuals have. Now, the idea is that this anti-normative behavior does not automatically weaken the norm. The key to understand of what's happening is the response of others, how society responds to it, right? So, I mean, if we go back to other norms, I mean, I already mentioned cannibalism, so I'll stick with this example. If we see that, for example, people don't punish such behavior or even follow it, try to mimic it, if we see that the expectations and attitudes of individuals are changing toward the norm, it's a potential signal that the norm is weakening because the expectations are changing, so maybe people don't take it as seriously or as important or even valid, right? But if a norm violation happens and there is a backlash against this anti-normative behavior and people see that the norm operates as it should, it might likely be reaffirmed as a result. So now, very quickly, let's go back to Russian invasion of Ukraine that is taking place still today. It's 1,000 days since the beginning of the invasion. What is clear, and what I absolutely agree with, is that this invasion brought nuclear weapons back at the forefront of world politics. This is like a small screenshot from a Google Trends search, in which you can see that, immediately after the invasion, suddenly there was a huge interest in nuclear weapons again. They once again became subject of a public debate after very, very long time. I myself, in my work, I think I was interviewed on nuclear weapons 3 months after the invasion more than for my whole life, by far. Suddenly I've seen interest from journalists, but not only them, right? I mean, in my life, my passion for all things nuclear was usually found to be like this obscure hobby that I have, and nothing, not like a serious thing, right? It was more like this Cold War thingy that has no meaning for our current life. But suddenly I'm finding myself having dinner with my grandmother and debating with her about the effects of nuclear war and what might happen if Putin actually decides to use nuclear weapons on Ukraine, and where she should be hiding, etc. Suddenly all the friends are approaching me and asking about nuclear war, nuclear use, nuclear bombs, what they do, what it might happen. So this is clear. I mean, the salience is there, and I'm pretty sure it will stay like that for quite some time, even if the interest has already passed slightly from the peak in 2022. My question is, especially in this book, is that if these empirical, normative, ontological, social expectations about nuclear taboo also changed, and then we can, through that, if we can see that the norm has been weakening or not. So I have two perspectives in the book. One is more macro, in which I basically look on how relevant actors in world politics respond, to what extent they affirm or not the validity of the norm, if they are willing to punish the transgressions, if they challenge this conventionalization of nuclear weapons, like making the line between nuclear and conventional weapons stronger or not. And by that, I'm looking at discourses, practices, initiatives, behavior of states, international organizations, and other actors that we consider the actors of world politics. But I also want to go on the micro level, basically trying to open this black box of a state and look at what people think, what individuals across different countries think, what they feel, what they believe in, and if these feeling, attitudes, beliefs, if they changed from the time before the invasion and today. And for that, we need a little bit different methods and a little bit different data to collect. So I will have a couple of comments on both of these perspectives, mainly on the micro, but let me start first with this macro, the bigger one. Together with my colleagues from Charles University and the German Institute for International Security Affairs, we are currently working on a very complex data set of all Russian nuclear threats in this war and all the responses that other states made. And there are some trends that are emerging that are fairly clear. So even though the global response to the war actually varied, with many states like China and India being very lukewarm or even somehow passively supporting Russia in its invasion, there are many countries in the global south that simply don't care that much, or they consider it as a fight between two very problematic actors and they don't want to be involved with. But when it comes to nuclear weapons and nuclear threats, suddenly there is a very wide agreement, with even China and India very vocally claiming that this is simply problematic, and they would very radically change their positions toward Russia if Russia used nuclear weapons, no matter how big or small or in what context. Simply this is like a big red line for them, which they signaled very explicitly, very openly, and very frequently. The same did Brazil, many other countries in the global south as well. And obviously the Western countries are having even stronger or more powerful reaction to this potential threat, right? For example, United States from the very beginning of the invasion signaled very clearly that it wouldn't be involved in the war militarily. It would support Ukraine through military deliveries, supplying Ukraine with weapons, with ammunition, but it wouldn't cross the threshold of being actively involved by themselves in the conflict, with one single exception. Basically in 2022, the United States signaled very clearly that the only bright line that they have in the conflict is not really Bucha or other war crimes, but any use of nuclear weapons, which would be the only reason when the United States basically signaled that would be the time when we engage conventionally and start fighting Russia on Ukraine somehow. This has been very strong signaling from basically all the relevant actors in world politics. We've seen a validation of the norm, basically claiming, yes, this norm exists and it's making our choices constrained. We didn't see any attempts to mimic Russian behavior. Actually, NATO in this case actually took a step down and didn't engage its own nuclear threats, actually tried to tone down the rhetoric as a lot and highlighting the fact that the taboo exists and it's important. We have seen a lot of signaling, punishment signaling, basically promising what would happen to Russia if Russia would transgress this norm, and not only by the West, but also non-Western states. We also saw a lot of attempt to reaffirm this conventional, unconventional boundary. By then, I mean to reaffirm that it really doesn't matter how big nuclear weapon is when it's used. Even a nuclear demonstration would be considered like an escalation that basically goes beyond anything we have seen so far. That it's not really about how many people die in a Russian attack. It's about the fact that nuclear weapons simply must not be used first. We also saw an interesting alignment between nuclear taboo and nuclear deterrence. This is kind of a fascinating topic by itself, because for many people, nuclear deterrence and nuclear taboo are like two things that simply cannot coexist together. But this is not what Nina Tanova originally claimed. She basically argued that these two things paradoxically reinforce each other, that by having the taboo on the use of nuclear weapons, the use is so politically hard to imagine that it's even reinforcing all these deterrent threats. And Russia, after some very heated period in 2022, actually went to great lengths to keep the official discourse, the official rhetoric, very close to their nuclear doctrine, and basically trying to refocus all these threats as a deterrent threat rather than mentioning any possibility that nuclear taboo doesn't exist or that could be violated just by itself, right? So there was a very strong attempt to realign the taboo and nuclear deterrence. And by the way, when we go back to the time of a Cold War, we have seen many of these periods when states, including the United States, actually engaged in nuclear threats. And it was also in this period when the taboo was getting stronger rather than weaker. And there's one more concept that I want to mention. This is what I call the counterfactual strengthening. And this is basically what people and states take from all of these stories of potential nuclear use. If you go back to Nina Tanova's book and look at the story of how nuclear taboo developed, she didn't claim or she didn't focus on periods when there was a relative calm and states had good relationships together. She actually focused on stories like, once again, the Korean War, when we actually saw the possibility that nuclear weapons would be used pretty close, that there were like serious attempts to suggest that using nuclear weapons could be militarily desirable for the United States in that case, and that it would have strategic effects that could be beneficial. But states didn't do it anyway, and that basically brought the whole world thinking, okay, so maybe there is some kind of a norm taking place, and this is the lesson that they took from it. So, I mean, I might be very wrong, and we might actually see nuclear use in this war, and then obviously we will have other problems than my book, that's for sure. But in any case, it would be a very different story, potentially. The thing is that if I'm right, this would be one of these cases when we actually consider nuclear use very credible. I mean, in October 2022, US government basically estimated that the use of nuclear weapons is very, very likely. There were some leaks in the press that some of the US officials actually estimated that maybe Russia would, there's a like 50-50 chance that Russia would use nuclear weapons. Russia eventually decided not to use nuclear weapons and call up the partial mobilization instead as a way of solving its problems in Ukraine. There was a lot of Chinese and Indian pressure at the time, but the story that most people and most states take from it, I mean, we don't know what was going on in Vladimir Putin's head, and we will never know, most likely. But the story that we are taking from it, that Russia seriously considered it, that most actors believe that there would be some strategic benefit for Russia of doing that, because it did consider it. And it still didn't do it. And it doesn't really matter if, to what extent Vladimir Putin believes in the norm. I mean, again, we have no way of knowing it. It's more like it kind of strengthened the feeling that most of the world actually believes that this norm is special. It's really important aspect of how world politics works, and it should be like that. So now to the micro perspective, which I will try to keep as brief as possible. These are the results of some of our surveys and survey experiments that we launched over the past few months and in a way years, because what we are trying to do is to replicate some of the previous findings and see how the views of individuals in different countries changed on nuclear use since the time before the invasion and after the invasion. So we did a bunch of these. Just very quickly, I just want to prevent one usual concern that people have is, why do you even study public opinion? It really doesn't matter, right? Anybody in my field who has ever tried to go to a peer review with an article based on public opinion, get at least one time some feedback. I mean, why do you study public opinion? Nobody cares. Decision makers don't care about public opinion when it comes to nuclear use. I could probably stick with the argument that Nina Tannenwald made, that public opinion is critical for understanding the taboo, and it emerged also because of the public pressure. But I didn't want to stop there, so we actually, very recently, with my colleagues Stephen Herzog, Lauren Sukin, and two of my colleagues from Prague, we actually did as an experiment to find out if decision makers actually care about public opinion when they are thinking about nuclear use. So these are the results of a survey where we were surveying government employees in the United Kingdom and United States, and we put them in the experiment to a position of an advisor to the president or prime minister in the UK case, and trying to provide them with different scenarios of potential nuclear use. In this case, it was Iran and a major chemical strike against US allies and US troops in the Middle East. And the only thing that we are changing in the experiment was a small piece of information about the level of public support for nuclear use, basically claiming that there was some kind of poll before the Iranian attack, and that kind of indicated what the public think about it, right? So we're varying to what extent public supports it or not. And we could see that in statistically significant terms, nuclear support for nuclear use and the belief that actually the president or prime minister would support nuclear use is rising with the public support for nuclear use. We also tried to do it with other scenarios. For example, we wanted to find out if threats are more credible when you are looking at other countries that have public support for nuclear use higher, and if we then believe that the country would be more likely to use nuclear weapons. And we saw the very similar effect that, for example, in this case, when there was a war between Pakistan and India was considering nuclear use, again, when the decision makers receive information that there is a high public support among Indian population for nuclear use, they were more likely to believe that the Prime Minister of India would actually resort to nuclear use. That was quite useful for us. But now let me go back to this attempt to replicate some of the previous findings, right? So these are that data we have from Russia. My colleague Michal and I, we did a study in 2021 where we measured the support for nuclear use against NATO among the Russian population. This is this first bar. And then we tried to replicate it 3 years later. What surprised us is that there was basically zero change. The change was lower than 1 percentage point. In statistical terms, there was no change whatsoever. One of the things that surprised us, especially in Russia, when Russian population is bombarded almost every day with late-night talk shows when nuclear weapons are brandished and talked about, we didn't see any change in support for nuclear use. We also wanted to check if this is just because people are just scared of NATO, so they are not considering it. So we try to provide an experimental condition with Ukraine, which doesn't have nuclear weapons, and it's very unlikely that the United States would respond with nuclear weapons if Russia would use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Again, we found basically the same amount of support, or lack of support in this case, for the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine. We tried to do the same for United States and United Kingdom when we had a study which we tried to follow up with the same respondents, basically the very same respondents that responded our survey in 2021 were surveyed again and gave us their opinion. Again, there was no change in statistically significant terms. I mean, the change is so small that it's just basically like an automatic variation. We tried to do the same with United States, UK, and France. That was the study of our friends and colleagues, Janina Dils, Scott Sagan, and Ben Valentino, where we tried to replicate their findings a few years later. Again, if something we saw like a lowered support for nuclear use, I would have some methodological concerns about France, but I don't want to go into details, but I have some concerns about the quality of the sample at the very beginning. The fact is that once again, we didn't see any increased willingness to accept the legitimacy of nuclear use or more support, right? Something that we should see if the taboo is crumbling. We tried to do the same in Germany, where we actually saw a relatively big effect in statistical terms when it comes to belief in nuclear deterrence. People were much more likely to believe that nuclear deterrence actually works and it deters other countries. So going from 2020 up until 2023, we saw a different 20 percentage points in beliefs of nuclear deterrence, but we didn't see any kind of effect like this on support for nuclear use. It basically stayed the same. Only like some 10% of population believe that in some extreme case, the use of nuclear weapons would be legitimate. There is a small twist that I have, and this is the last thing that I will have, and then I finish, is that when you are looking at the numbers, you might also like make a concern. Sure, I mean, the attitudes didn't change, but they are still relatively high. Of course, I mean, we are talking about very extreme cases, but still, I mean, talking about, some 50% support for nuclear use in some scenarios doesn't seem so much like a taboo. The thing is that, or the argument that I make in the book is that even if this social norm exists, and it's like most people are somehow constrained by it, not all of them, but most people, if we would call it a taboo, it's mainly an elite taboo, mainly held by political elites across the world rather than the ordinary people or the ordinary population. We basically came up with this idea to do some experiments where we were trying to survey with the same set of questions and scenarios and conditions the public and elites. In this case, we were surveying the members of the British Parliament. And we really saw a huge drop in support for nuclear use when you ask the parliamentarians rather than the general public, right? In this case, it was some 30% point drop in which parliamentarians were way less likely to support nuclear use in one specific context. We tried to do the same in case of Germany when we were working with the members of the German Bundestag, the lower chamber of the German parliament. And again, the change in the views was statistically significant across the board. So very quickly, the summary of the arguments in my book, which once again I stress is a work in progress, it's under development, and I need to go back home and start writing properly. But anyway, the argument is that nuclear weapons become more salient in world politics in what we call the third nuclear age today. But there is little evidence that the taboo itself would be eroded, that people would be, or generally the world would be more likely to believe that the use of nuclear weapons is more legitimate, that it's more more acceptable normatively. We could see that international response to Russia's nuclear saber-rattling threats, different very escalatory dynamics, mostly reaffirmed the nuclear taboo as one of the key prohibitory international norms. That states express a lot of willingness, or signaled of willingness to punish this transgression, even compared to like very serious war crimes that are taking place in Ukraine every single day. We also saw little evidence that individuals in different countries would be now less constrained by the norm than before the war. But yes, there is this one aspect that I wanted to mention, that in our view, the taboo, as Nina originally understood it, is mainly deeply held by the elites and segments of the populations, and others are much more, let's say, reliant of their social expectations about the taboo and are much less constrained in the strength of the taboo as Nina Tannevold originally conceptualized it. So these are my websites where we usually try to provide some links to our research, data sets, some policy relevant findings. So if you would like to follow up on this research, you are totally welcome to visit my pages. I will try to put as much stuff as possible over the next year. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay, we'll go Justin and then Riley.
Hello, thank you so much for coming and giving this talk. Specifically on when you mentioned the sort of elite aspect of the taboo. I mean, in the US, we're broadly seeing a degradation of sort of expertise and public acknowledgement of expertise and almost a diminishing of that elite position. I was wondering how that might be playing into the taboo globally if we continue to see that trend towards more right authoritarian beliefs.
No, that's an excellent question. Actually, my concern is that once I get back home and in December, I will be sending the update to the publisher about what I have done this year. I mean, his question would be, okay, so have you considered like including a chapter on Trump and what is taking place right now in US politics? And I think it's very likely that this would happen, right? And again, I mean, my argument is not really that the world will stay the same like it is now. Actually, like the whole framework that I have is very open to the idea that the norm can actually change. It actually can get weaker. And I mean, if someone would be asking me to provide a scenario, I mean, I can imagine like the possibility, for example, that, you know, Russia would use like a small scale nuclear weapon against Ukraine. I mean, and Trump would be also trigger happy and, you know, start, you know, threatening China with nuclear weapons at some point, making a nuclear demonstration. And suddenly we would see a very different world in which both people on this micro level, but also states and international organizations would simply change their expectations and start believe that we are now in a world where nuclear weapons are simply sometimes used. And we can imagine such a world. I definitely don't want such a world, that's for sure. I want to stress that. And I don't think it's necessarily likely, but I believe it's also possible, right? And it very much depends on how states will behave, how they will respond to both like people and states talking about violations, but even straight out violating this nuclear non-use norm. And yeah, I mean, in the current climate in the United States, it is possible that the United States will actually stop being the actor that is trying to prevent the taboo from weakening, but start being the actor that maybe is signaling that the taboo should be even weakened, right? And it's very hard to say it would. I don't know. I don't think it's a likely course of action that will be taken, but we cannot rule it out. And my understanding of how norms change is definitely open to the possibility that it will go in a very different direction. I mean, it's a very good question. I'm really wondering about the current administration and what they would do with nuclear weapons, because yeah, I mean, looking at it from Europe, it's fairly scary, to be frank.
And also, we're seeing a divergence of expertise and elite, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Also, yeah.
Riley and then Allison.
I don't know who was that.
He's on the end.
Okay.
I wonder if this would be a good time to go to kind of circle back and see where the concept of the taboo came from in the first place, right? And you know, we talked about deterrence, and buried in deterrence is the concept of mutual destruction, you know, and end of world. You know, that comes from the 1940s and 50s, and maybe those concepts have disappeared now. We don't remember those. And it could be that the elites do, the elites, you know, have that concept in the front of their mind more than the general public does. So could you talk about, you know, where we came up with why we have a taboo anyway? You know?
No, I mean, just to start from what you finished, yeah, I mean, I believe that the reason why, at least in these countries that I have surveyed, it might not be the case everywhere, but why they perceive the taboo more is simply they are more engaging with the idea that there is a taboo, right? It's not like an automatic concept, right? I mean, they are much more likely to talk to other elites, to diplomats, to NGOs, and basically like get this understanding that there is something like principally wrong with using nuclear weapons, right? The taboo has its origins. Rebecca can correct me if she remembers it differently, but in the book, it's basically starting already like right after the Second World War, right? Because I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the only military use of nuclear weapons, say for nuclear explosions for testing purposes, and there were like different lessons taken from there. And at that time, it wasn't clear that there would actually be such a taboo as it developed, right? I mean, there's a lot of archaeological material about studying how policymakers, presidents, and their advisors were basically discussing to how would the world react if we would now use a nuclear weapon. At the beginning, I mean, there were arguments even explicitly made that there is no reason why we shouldn't use nuclear weapons as just another weapon in our arsenal, right? In the 1950s, there was a lot of concern on the side of US policymakers that the taboo is emerging or was emerging, right? They were actually concerned about it because they were afraid that this would really constrain their choices. So there was this attempt to develop small, non-small in reverse commas, relatively small nuclear weapons, which we call the tactical nuclear weapons or non-strategic nuclear weapons, which would be specifically designed for battlefield use, and they will have like a limited explosive power. And they believe that this is their way of how to get the taboo from nuclear weapons, that you can actually field these small weapons, which would then be practically usable. The thing is that very soon, this understanding simply didn't stick. And today, when you are looking at proclamations of US military, I mean, the head of Stratcom and other very important influential military people, I mean, they are systematically over the course of 10 years in almost every interview highlighting, no, any use of nuclear weapons would be strategic. There is no really such a thing as tactical nuclear use. I mean, we believe that using a nuclear weapon in any context, no matter how big explosion is or how many people die, is simply bringing the world to a new reality, to new world, right? I mean, it's a transformatory thing. So in a way, there were attempts to even somehow put the taboo out and grapple with that, but the history went its own course. So in a way, we saw the taboo emerge, getting stronger, and it's not obviously absolute. I mean, all the states basically understand that there are cases in which they would use nuclear weapons, right? The taboo was never put on a test in which the country would be facing existential threats, right? That, for example, the United States would be invaded and its mainland would be invaded by other countries. I mean, yeah, Russia is technically invited, when it comes to Russia proper, but we are talking a very small, limited incursion, just like across the border, and nobody really believes that this is that anybody in Russia considers to be existential threat, right? So the taboo was never put on such an extreme test. And I would also make an argument when we are talking about norms. I mean, even the stronger norms can be violated, and we can ourselves imagining violating them, right? If I go back to the idea of cannibalism, I mean, if I put in front of you a survey in which I give you a scenario in when you are with your family in a deserted place and it's the only way of how to survive is, you found a dead person and you could eat it. I mean, it sounds terrible. You probably don't want to do it. It's very hard to imagine it. I mean, you feel a sense of revulsion, but you basically agree, okay, I mean, in this case, I mean, survival is more important, right? And this is how many states, I think about the potential of nuclear use, right? So I think the threshold that it must be completely ruled out was never there and will never be there. I mean, we do imagine a situation in which nuclear weapons would be used. We, and by we, I mean nuclear armed states, which I'm not from, but you get the point, are simply not using them, in situation where it would be just strategically beneficial. And yeah, I mean, it took a few decades to basically build this taboo.
We'll have to apologize because people who study the nuclear taboo talk about cannibalism a lot.
Yeah, well, usually we use cannibalism or incest, so I'm not sure which of the examples you want me to use. I usually find cannibalism easier to talk about, but I'm happy to switch if anyone wants. But yeah, sure.
So I was struck by something. I'm assuming that when you replicated your studies, it was about use in response to Russia, correct? Or just use in general?
Different scenarios, context, different cases, right? There were some experiments that basically studied the use of nuclear weapons against terrorist groups, and there are hidden WMD laboratories. There were cases of Russia being to conflict. Yeah, there were different cases. There was conflict between the United States and North Korea, so different contexts.
Because I was struck by the differences in the findings, and I'm wondering if the taboo persists in terms of using nuclear weapons against certain people, certain states. Because if you look at the level of dehumanization of particularly Muslims, Muslim countries, Iran, it seems that maybe you ought to be exploring whether there are different thresholds based on who the nuclear weapon is being used against. Because the numbers for use against Iran are not only quite striking, but they conform with that level of rhetoric that you hear. And particularly since the October 7th attack, you've been hearing a tremendous increase in calling for the use of nuclear weapons, not only against Iran, but also against the Gaza Strip, against Syria, against other countries in the Middle East, with none of the punishment signaling. And so perhaps it's the who as much as the use.
No, that's a very good point, and I absolutely agree. I mean, the key here is not really to compare to what extent people support nuclear use against Iran or North Korea, because that absolutely is different, right? I mean, let's not pretend here. I mean, people can imagine generally, use of military force against different countries, different nations, different ethnicities, different races in a, very biased way, right? It's not like, we are willing to accept the same kind of punishment against anyone, right? So, and the level of dehumanization, as you just described it, it's really the key to understanding it, right? When we dehumanize our opponent, we are probably, more willing to accept use of nuclear weapons or other weapons as more legitimate. For me, the key is to always study if the support for nuclear use against this particular group changed over time, right? So if we are looking at, I absolutely agree that the support for nuclear use against Iran would be different than against some other countries. For me, the critical issue is if this changed from 2021 to 2024, which is after the invasion. Because if this normative grip of the nuclear taboo basically weakened, we should see like a relatively higher support, because simply people wouldn't feel these political consequences of nuclear use that much, right? And if there is actually like a higher level of dehumanization against Iranians, which might be the case, I think that's a persuasive case to be made. That's actually like it's even making my test even harder, right? Because the support should be also higher just because of this fact, but we didn't see that.
The original stay in Valentino was an Iranian scenario, right?
They have different ones, right? We didn't replicate the one you mentioned in 2017. That was the Hiroshima in Iran. This one we didn't replicate, but we might actually. That's not a bad idea. They did have one against terrorist group in Syria and one in Libya. That was the latest one, I would say. I mean, Nina Tanevro did criticize a lot their choices, because she basically says, you guys are just studying the use of nuclear weapon against brown people in the Middle East, and that says something very different than just like saying, you are basically like trying to find a case in which, this is really the most likely case. I think in a way the argument was fair. I mean, Scott Sagan was arguing back that sure, they are trying to find plausible cases, because otherwise it makes no sense to study the use of nuclear weapons, between United States and United Kingdom or whatever. But I understand where she's coming from also. But again, like for me, the main important thing is like this temporal dynamics, right? We can see over time that there is some kind of loosening of the norm, or people somehow feel it's more legitimate to use nuclear weapons, because this is what we should see. Yeah. But otherwise, I agree.
We'll get Riley because he needs to go, and then we'll go.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Thank you. So we've seen, going back to what Professor Gibbons said at the beginning, since the U.S. and Joe Biden authorized ATACMS and long-range missile strikes into Russia, those on the right here in the United States have again sounded the three-alarm fire of this again shows why Trump needs to get in on day one and end the war in Ukraine. So my question to you is whether or not we think how likely that is. Fast forward 2 or 3 months, the right and the Trump administration comes to an agreement that ends the war in Ukraine, and one of their main reasons is we need to stop this before we escalate to nuclear war. Does that strengthen the taboo? And if so, is that a cost that the world and or the United States should be willing to pay to show that, you know, this nuclear threat works?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The way I view it is that, you know, like 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years after this scenario happens, we'll be simply looking once again at the world and how states, organizations, people think about it and how they interpret it, right? I mean, if this story will be, and this is like the more likely case in my view, is that people simply learn, sure, I mean, nuclear weapons are back. I mean, states do make deterrent threats. We are facing a great power competition in which, you know, states are competing over very important interests they have, and this is like a big deal thing, right? So, and nuclear weapons do play a role with that, but at the same time, we see that, you know, even in these high level encounters and very stressful situations in which countries are fighting to death in a way, we see that nuclear weapons can be used as a tool for pressure, for coercion, but states actually feel that there are huge political consequences, because we actually can see that states actually care a lot about nuclear use, and it would be a big problem for them. I still believe that I wouldn't necessarily say that nuclear will be stronger. I would just say it will be reaffirmed and it wouldn't be weaker. That's my understanding. But at the same time, I can give you an example of my framework, how it can be applied to a different norm. And that would be like the opposite effect, right? Because if we will see this war ended with Russia basically getting away with conquering 20% of Ukraine, you know, basically gaining new territory. This is a violation of a very long-standing norm against territorial conquest, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there is a case, or it is a high-profile case, that any state after Second World War would invade another country, but basically acquire a new territory from another state, right? Sure, there were wars against contested territories like Azerbaijan, Armenia quite recently, right? But this was a territory that was contested from the beginning. Basically, these two countries have been fighting over it since 1990s. But I don't think that there was a case after the Second World War in which some country would simply invade and just gain territory. This was absolutely common in the past. I mean, in the 19th century, it wasn't even considered wrong. It was just like a normal thing to do, right? If you can do it, it's absolutely all right. People don't consider it to be like something that is wrong. It's simply like, okay, if you are a loser, that's a bad thing for you, but you understand it's kind of like a normal behavior. We don't see it that way after the Second World War. We just consider it wrong. So there is a strong norm against this. At the same time, if Russia actually gets away from this, there is actually a good argument to be made that other countries would be seeing it and, you know, try it as well, because they would see, okay, Russia actually got away with it. Russia was stronger, managed to acquire territory. States eventually, you know, cease their sanctions. United States would probably make some kind of a deal that the sanctions would be eventually elevated. And now we'll be in a world that maybe other states would consider it like a legitimate way of gaining territory. Again, I don't think it's necessary that this will happen, but once again, it depends on the reactions that other states would have, if they would mimic it, if there would be further punishment. But I think that a good case could be made that this norm can actually be at least weakened. We can even, you know, say that it would disintegrate a lot, and it might have a huge effect on world politics. Sorry, yeah.
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the concept of taboo. Of course, initially it's a religious term, right? Taboos were something that were against coming near something that was very powerful, extremely powerful. But if you came too near it, it would destroy you. Now, nuclear weapons are interesting because they're good. It's using them that's bad, right? And so, of course, the justification for us in the United States about to spend another $1 trillion on them is that, well, we wouldn't use them. It's a deterrent. But if you can't use them, how is it a deterrent? There's a paradox here, a logical paradox. And I wonder if you could think or speak to us about that a bit.
No, that's a great question. You are absolutely right. It is a paradox in a way, and it's like it comes uneasy to people when they think about it, right? For many reasons. So sure, I mean, taboo is originally, you know, anthropological, sociological concepts, you know, about things that cannot be even touched. And to be frank, I mean, Nina Tannenwald has faced a lot of criticism for basically using the term, right? And to be honest, I mainly use it for the sake of the fact that simply everybody just like intuitively understand what I'm talking about. But I don't consider it the taboo in the sense that we usually understand the taboos in our society, right? And I mean, she got a lot of like pushback on the like anthropological roots of the taboo term. Basically, there was a lot of critique that, I mean, how it can be taboo when, you know, we are actually able to put words into our, you know, military doctrine and speak about doing something which is a taboo, which just doesn't sound right. I'm kind of slightly been tired by this discussion in the academic world because it seems like, you know, we are just all repeating this all over again. What is quite important for me is even policymakers kind of like intuitively understand what it's about. And for me, you know, there's a long-standing debate in our field whether, you know, it's more of a taboo, like a moral norm, or a more tradition, which is really based on, you know, like, which is more fragile, and it's really based more on how other states behave. I do think it's somehow, you know, halfway, to be frank, that sure, I mean, there are definitely some people and segments of the population that consider it as a very strong moral norm, and that they, you know, that they basically would be against using nuclear weapons even if all other states would be using them, right? But I would say that's also like quite likely with many different uses of military force overall, right? There are some people that just don't want us to do it. They just consider it wrong. I think that's still like the strongest factor underpinning this taboo or this tradition of non-use is simply that, you know, states are kind of delicately looking at what other states are doing. They understand there would be political punishment if they would use nuclear weapons. They actually don't want to see a world where nuclear weapons are used or used commonly. There will be just worse for everybody, including them. And they just don't want to enter this world, and they don't want to get this political punishment. And they're actually, you know, convinced that the punishment would be taking place. And it does sit uneasy with nuclear deterrence. I would say that states can be constrained, or, you know, elites can be constrained by the idea that, you know, there is a very strong social norm, but also kind of signal that even if in very extreme circumstances there will be nuclear use, I mean, this is still important, right? Because, I mean, if we consider the potential for nuclear use to being 1%, 0.5%, 0.1%, I mean, sure, these are relatively low probabilities, but the effect or consequences are so huge that just states don't want to go there. Right? So they are very often deterred by stuff. Of course, not absolutely. I mean, there's always this argument. So if deterrence works, you know, why is United States providing Ukraine with, I don't know, ATAK-MS, right? Simply because, I mean, this is not an automatic process, right? I mean, states understand that nuclear weapons are simply not used they are not credibly used in many circumstances, which the taboo actually is reinforcing, and there are only extreme circumstances in which they would be used. We don't know exactly what these circumstances are. We can very easily imagine like an escalatory trajectory that brings us there very quickly, and we don't even know how. You know, it can be a very quick process, but all this messiness is simply making the whole situation, very complex, right? So we understand that there are political consequences, that it's wrong to do it first, that there are huge potential strategic consequences, but we also understand there is a small probability of nuclear use, and that's kind of enough to deter big stuff, right? And I think it's a fair argument to be made that Russia is using nuclear weapons to deter United States successfully from engaging militarily, right? I mean, I did speak with a lot of military people across Europe, and it's not like that we would be happy to engage military in the conflict with Russia if Russia wouldn't have nuclear weapons. But many admit that, sure, I mean, probably there will be such a huge political push that it might, there will be some military intervention, right? I mean, at least on some level of, I don't know, using cruise missiles to help Ukraine, if there wouldn't be concern about nuclear retaliation. And there is a huge concern about nuclear retaliation or nuclear escalation, that simply the situation would get out of hand and at some point Russia would use nuclear weapon. So, I mean, I know it's not a satisfactory answer in a way because these two concepts do sit together very uneasy, but my ultimate argument is that simply now we need to get used to the fact that we are reliving something we have already lives through, right? I mean, the thing is that it's not like that we're in a world where suddenly there is nuclear deterrence and also nuclear taboo. We already had this world during Cold War, right? So maybe like the right way to look at it, where we had just some relatively brief intermezzo between the end of the Cold War and a new start, or a new Cold War or new great power competition. And suddenly we are seeing some of the same themes that we have seen before, right? And suddenly we see nuclear weapons being subject of public debate, which they were in the 1980s and 1970s, right? We suddenly see nuclear threats being made, which were made during the whole Cold War, right? Suddenly we see nuclear weapons being a topic that ordinary people are talking about, which they were during Cold War, but were not necessarily in the late 1990s or early 2000s, right? So it's kind of repeating what we have already seen before. That would be my argument.
I think we have one last question, maybe two last questions. First in this row and then in the back. Okay, maybe we'll collect the last three. You want to collect?
Yeah, I just have a terrible memory, so I have to.
Am I good? Okay. So my question is, you're talking about nuclear taboo in countries that do have nuclear capacities. Are you thinking of doing any research in countries that don't have nuclear capacities, such as Ukraine? Especially since it's interesting because Ukraine had one of the biggest nuclear arsenals, and how that works. Is that something you're interested in doing, possibly? Finding out about how people who have had nuclear capacities, how they view the taboo.
That's a good question. All right, we'll collect the last three. And then.
How much of a natural deterrent do you think nuclear fallout is? When we dropped the bomb on Japan, we didn't do it on Tokyo. We did it on cities that were more remote from the other countries. I'm thinking if Russia were to drop a bomb on their adversary, they better know which way the wind is blowing. Is that something that you think is a deterrent, or have we done something to minimize that?
Realistically speaking, do you think with the current policies both Russia and the US have on nuclear use, which kind of enable escalation should there ever be first use and that taboo is broken, do you think there will ever realistically be a world where nuclear use is like cannibalism? It happens only in the most desperate circumstances, but it still happens, rather than it's used once and we escalate to a point where the potential for nuclear use is not possible because it's so devastating?
Thank you. Great questions. The first one about if we did studies in countries like Ukraine, we didn't. Actually, I would be very interested in what Ukrainians think about it overall. I mean, today it's possible to do surveys there, but it's slightly tricky, and we just didn't do it. It's actually interesting because on the one hand, if we would ask Ukrainians whether they would like to develop their own nuclear arsenal or have it, I'm actually pretty sure that we would see like a spike above, right? We can see it also in the discourse of President Zelensky and some other high-ranking members of his cabinet that they at least speak about it. So there is definitely not a taboo on thinking about developing nuclear weapons. Absolutely not. But I actually even saw like interesting remarks that were not that much in press, but even President Zelensky, where he was making proclamation that he actually believes the taboo operate, and that Vladimir Putin is constrained, if not by his own mind, which he calls him psychopath, but he's definitely constrained by for example, Russian public opinion, which does sound strange because Russia is definitely not a democratic country by far, but public opinion plays a distinct role in Russia, surprisingly high. I mean, for example, to the extent that it's constraining the choices of the Kremlin when it comes to mobilization, it's actually very visible that this plays a role. So, I mean, there is definitely understanding in some of these countries there may be higher support for nuclear acquisition. I'm not contesting them. I have my doubts that they would see nuclear use more legitimate. They would just see it as a way of basically deterring Russian aggression and mainly future Russian aggression, which is basically the most important thing for Ukrainians right now, right? To find a way of how to deter another Russian aggression once there is some kind of a ceasefire or a peace agreement. But I would love to do some surveys there eventually. Sure, nuclear fallout. Yeah, I mean, I think that generally, like the fact that the use of nuclear weapons simply has consequences that goes beyond like the single use, and there are effects that persist. I mean, I think this is a part of the reason why nuclear weapons have been stigmatized as weapons that are somehow unique and different and that deserve a different political attention. I absolutely agree with that. I mean, the states did take some effort to let's say, have weapon designs that minimize fallout. There's also like a different ways of how you use nuclear weapons. I mean, there's a website where you can actually try to calculate of how much fallout there is. I don't, maybe Rebecca, if there is some kind of newsletters, can send out this very this very famous calculator where you can actually see like some parameters in which, for example, if you detonate nuclear weapon relatively high above the ground, it can actually have very destructive effects, but you can limit nuclear fallout a lot through different, different types of uses. So, I mean, yeah, I can imagine that if there would be such an extreme scenario in which Russia would consider using nuclear weapons, for example, if there would be a huge collapse of Russian forces in Ukraine, which was quite a possibility in October 2022, and that Russia, or specifically Kremlin, would be believing that this is endangering the stability of the regime, not necessarily of Russia, but their own regime, maybe their survival. If there would be such an extreme case, I believe that Russia would probably not be stopped by the concern about nuclear fallout, because they would find a way how to do it to make the fallout relatively limited. And I mean, if the result would be that some people in Russia would, die from nuclear fallout as a result of winds blowing Russian way, it would be a situation in which this would be relatively limited effect compared to what they are going for. That would be my estimate, right? So it does have an effect, and it's calculated in this, but it's actually part of the story why nuclear weapons are kind of considered special for such a long time. And sorry, remind me the question. I apologize. I tell you, I have a terrible memory. I'm terrible.
Okay. I was asking. So you likened the taboo of nuclear weapons to cannibalism a lot. But do you ever think, because of our current policies, both American and Russian policies,
that it can actually change? Yeah, or how it can change if there would be nuclear use?
Yeah, if there would be nuclear use, do you think it will ever be like?
Yeah. Okay. Now I know perfectly. Yeah, that's actually a great question that I wasn't the person that did the first thinking on this. I think in Nina's book, the original one, there is actually a discussion of these scenarios, and it's fairly much aligned with, I would say, my theoretical framework, because she says that the use of nuclear weapons can have like very different consequences, and we simply have no idea what exactly the reaction would be. And we can imagine very different scenarios. For example, in scenario one, we can see that Russia used nuclear weapons relatively effectively. They actually achieved some strategic effects that surprisingly there was, less fallout than people expected, less casualties, but a relatively high strategic effect. Ukraine yielded, Russia emerged winner. And other countries would see, all right, so maybe using nuclear weapons is actually a good idea. We would see other countries mimicking it. Suddenly we would see, Pakistan escalating because they would see that, the use of nuclear weapons is credible and there could be strategic effects. And we would be in a world where nuclear weapons are sometimes used. For the nerds, I'm usually referring to the old sci-fi series Battlestar Galactica, where we basically see, a colleague of mine wrote an academic article on this subject, where it's just taken for granted that states are using nuclear weapons. It's just like a normal thing. They are basically describing our world with, normal people, but that developed in a little bit different trajectory, and states basically accepted that sometimes nuclear weapons are used as a weapon of choice, and it's not considered like totally unique somehow. But we can also imagine the opposite, right? We can imagine that Russia would use nuclear weapon, and it would be a mayhem, and suddenly you would see nuclear use and the humanitarian consequences and environmental consequences connected with nuclear use on CNN in color, not Hiroshima, Nagasaki on black-white pictures from the 1940s, but suddenly on color, very vivid. I mean, terrible imaginaries of, people being incinerated, terrible cancers. I mean, just like disastrous effects. And there would be a lot of pushback against this, and there would be like a new push for nuclear disarmament, with people basically demanding that this must stop, that this was like the worst thing that has happened for a long time, and we cannot live, in a world where nuclear holocaust can be a part of. And I don't know which of these like two very different scenarios would take place. I don't think we will ever know, and I definitely don't advocate for nuclear use as being a way for achieving nuclear disarmament. I don't think that and justify the means in any case, absolutely not. But we can definitely imagine that this would be the story that would take place. So, and again, it very much depends of how the world would interpret what just happened and how they would react.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and join me in thanking.
Thank you so much.